Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sophia Bordell, and today we have a very special guest, freelance editor Jolie Hobbs. Jolie Hobbs, founder of The Absent-Minded Bookworm, is a developmental, line, and copy editor. She offers resources to spark creativity and refine content, along with comprehensive reports on improving plot, pace, character development, readability, and flow. Thanks for joining us today, Jolie.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
We're so happy to have you. And today I want to discuss developmental editing with you. So, first off, I want to talk about improving plot and pace. How would you identify plot holes or inconsistencies, and what strategies do you typically use to address them?
Yeah. So there are three common errors when it comes to this. There's logical errors, there's character inconsistencies, and timelines are big. So those are three to pay very close attention to. A few ways to address these are keep a list. So you have an outline. When you keep a list as you write, you can go back to your outline and bounce that up against it and just make sure that you're tracking. And then keep a timeline of events. That's very important because then you can go back and you can check, and that's very common. Writers will often miss, certain time frames, or they'll skip over months or years, or pregnancy ends up lasting 12 months instead of 9, that kind of thing. And do your research. Research is probably the least favorite thing for some writers to do, which is very interesting. I think it can be tedious, especially if you're writing fiction. You want to have some fun. And so it might be a little more challenging to go back and do that research. But if you've got a character that's climbing Mount Everest in the winter, stop and go back and check that, because, the best times are to climb in the late spring or early summer. Those kind of things. So yeah, the list making, the timeline, and checking those against your outline, and then do your research.
Well, that's great advice. And I know for some authors, from what I've heard, it can be a little bit hard to have attention to detail sometimes because they are creatives. So
Yeah, that's
great
right.
advice. And what techniques would you say are good for improving the pacing of a story?
So the first thing, and I think something that a lot of writers skip over because they have these ideas in their head and they want to start writing, but starting with understanding what your character's arc is really important. What is the trajectory of their narrative? So if you've got that, then the next step is easy, because then you want to make a list of potential crisis or challenges that this character is going to face, and how that makes sense in their character's arc. But when you get to the crisis, this to me is the fun part, because you can really flex your creative muscle, go wild. Anything and everything is fair game when you're making that list. Throw as many hot potatoes at your your main character as you can to keep them juggling. And that's really interesting and engaging for the reader. Some common challenges, when you think about what we face in real life, there is character versus themselves. So you've got those internal challenges. Then you've got character versus character, and whatever that conflict might be. You've got character versus nature. If you're climbing Mount Everest, that's a pretty big obstacle. And character versus technology is common in writing. Like, the one that I always think of is the Terminator, the ultimate
Right.
human versus technology. So keep those things in mind, and, some helpful hints or build-in breathers for your readers. So you do want a lot of juggling going on. You do want those hot potatoes. You just want to keep throwing those balls at them. But building in breathers can actually help create more tension and more suspense for the reader, because they get a little comfortable and now you hit them again.
Right.
And then again, make sure you have that full character analysis, because you need to know how your character is going to manage each situation, each crisis, each challenge. How are they going to get themselves out of it? Do they get themselves out of it? So those are some easy, quick ideas.
Well, those are great, easy, quick ideas. Great points. And on the note of characters and character development, what would you say are common issues that you see with character development, and how do you suggest fixing those?
Ones that come to mind, because I was just dealing with these recently, but they are very common, is great story. The writer has a great story, but they have the bland character.
Mm.
The other one, and this one is really big, and it's balancing the show and tell. So, if we start with the first one, so first, the great story, bland character, story reigns supreme. So really, if you've got a great story, you're doing great. You're on track. You've got it. Everything else is manageable. Know your character's arc. Is it positive? Is it negative? Or is it flat? Um, and then use that character's arc to build your character analysis. So how do you build a character analysis? The best way, the easiest way, the way that I do it is to ask questions of your character. What are their best qualities? What are their worst qualities? Who are their best friends? Why? How do they act when they're irritated, sad, bored, um, that kind of happy? What do they keep to themselves or lie about? Versus what do they share openly? So really just try to come up with as many questions as you can to ask of that character, and that helps a lot. A comprehensive character analysis really is the best way to create that vivid character and give the reader somebody to love or hate to love or love to, that kind of thing, or be afraid of.
Right.
That's probably one of the biggest deals. And I think it's easy to overlook that because you've got a good story in mind and you want to write this story, and then you kind of, you put that to the wayside in the writing. The second issue that I mentioned is show versus tell. So knowing when to show versus when to tell is one of the most difficult aspects of writing.
Mm.
Both are necessary. So you'll have some people that are very strong proponents of showing and never tell, always show. I think balance is important, as with everything else, but showing is harder to achieve and it's
Yeah.
easier to tell. So Hemingway is probably one of the best known champions of show. And he had what was called the iceberg theory, or the theory of omission. And that's the idea where, an iceberg, you only see, I'm going to paraphrase it, I'm not quoting him, you see just a small piece above the water, and that's the only thing that's visible to you. And Hemingway said, the grace or the dignity of that iceberg is what you don't see, is the fact that you only see that little amount. And so subtext and what you're not telling, the untold, speaks volumes. It allows the reader to use their own imagination. And I think knowing when to do that is important.
I want to transition a little bit and talk on enhancing readability and the flow. How do you typically handle issues with dialogue that feel stilted or unnatural?
A lot of writers will hate to hear me say this, but it holds true. Read it out loud or record it, read it and record it, and then listen back. And I know that writers get very frustrated sometimes when they hear this, because it's like, what else can I do? That's the best thing, aside from having somebody else listen to it and listen to, have the writer record themselves and have somebody else listen to them and how they're reading it, because the writer knows their words the best. So that's the first thing. We'll move on, because there's some writers probably cringing when they hear that, but being true to your characters is very important. And if you think about what your character would say, is it a reserved Victorian character? Are they a loudmouth, obnoxious brute? Do they curse? Do they exaggerate? Are they very sensitive? And knowing that character is very important to being true to that character. Another way is that character analysis. You put that to good use, and being true to the character and not yourself is what's important. And as we write, we sometimes tend to fall into who are we and what would we think. And so you just want to be mindful of that. Using dialogue as sort of a key element to advancing your plot is common, but that can be very tricky, and it can be you can easily fall into an unnatural voice if you're trying to wedge something in there. to let your reader know what's going on. And audiobooks, it's interesting. This is one thing that's probably most distracting for me, and I think it is for other audiobook readers, is in dialogue when you have a lot of dialogue and and he said this and she said this and he said so and so said Bob. Um, that can become very fatiguing for the reader to listen to. So I want to caution myself, because clearly identifying who the speaker is very important. I'm a
Mm.
proponent of it, but being aware of the format that you're publishing in and thinking, do I need to be a little more creative if I'm publishing in audio, to keep the reader engaged, is important.
I want to transition a little bit and touch on feedback and communication. What is the best way for authors to communicate their vision and goals to you as an editor?
A lot of this lies with the editor. I take it upon myself to get the information that I need from them to make sure that I'm helping them. I start with a questionnaire on paper and I ask a variety of questions. It just depends on the genre, but I want to know, what are your publishing goals? What format are you publishing in? What are you going for? Why did you write this story? Did you write it for yourself? Who's your target audience? What are your favorite books, TV shows, authors? Because that tells me, before I even read their manuscript, it tells me what I might expect from a style perspective. And when I get into it, sometimes I'm surprised, but usually I'm not. Um, and a lot of times authors will say, I need a proofreader. And that word proofreader is used as a catch-all for every kind of editor. And so that's another reason a questionnaire helps, but it's also really important for me to have a conversation. So once I get that questionnaire back, I'm going to have a conversation with the author and start digging in a little bit. If they've told me they need a proofreader, if they told me they need a copy editor, I'm going to start asking questions to evaluate what it is they really do need. And then I bounce that up against what they want. So this is very important, I think, and it's an easy trap for editors to fall into, is what I think they need versus what they want. If we can't get aligned, the author is the boss. So if we can't get aligned, I'm gonna give them my recommendations, I'm gonna give them my suggestions, but ultimately it's their decision, and I need to figure out how to balance and get aligned with them. So, authors, they've spent a lot of time on their work and it's very sentimental. Their words matter to them. And just respecting that, I think, is very important as an editor.
How do you typically approach books that are various different genres, such as romance versus all the way to a psychological thriller?
There is no one size fits all. So it seems like there would be, but most editors specialize in certain genres, and there's a reason for that. With nonfiction, the editors are going to be more focused on inconsistencies, like with the timeline, things like that. Language use is important in nonfiction. Fact checking is very important in nonfiction. With fiction, it's really a lot about, how are you developing your characters? What's their backstory? How well do you apply imagery? So the different genres, like psychological thrillers, we just talked about this, right? Pace is very important in a psychological thriller. So as an
Mhm.
editor, I'm really going to hone in on that. How's the pace? Are we fast? Is it breathtaking? Mysteries, it's all about the red herrings and the twist and misdirecting the reader. And so that's where the focus is. Romance novels, I'm not as familiar with, but I'm pretty sure there's a lot of adjectives and a lot of body parts, right? So you want to
Yeah.
have a lot, those are the things you want to look for there. And, characters that are swoon worthy, and have that magnetic attraction. So despite those differences, there are certain things that are common across all genres. Point of view is very important. It doesn't matter what you're doing, whether it's a memoir or fiction work or whatever. Point of view is big. Imagery is always still big. Sensory of detail, and conflict is the king and queen of writing.
Well, Jolie, thank you. That was wonderful insight on developmental editing.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time.
Lastly, where can our listeners find and connect with you?
Instagram at Absent Minded Bookworm. Also LinkedIn, The Absent Minded Bookworm. Facebook, same. I've got a Twitter account as well, and my website is www.absentminded.com. absentmindedbookworm.com.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to today's interview with freelance editor Jolie Hobbs. Be sure to check out our website for more videos. Wishing you all a fulfilling and successful writing journey.